Hi everybody, welcome back to my series about how to face the Slav defense with the white pieces using the line d4, d5, c4, c6, c takes d5, c takes d5, and bishop g5. In the first part, I did a basic overview of this opening, and I talked about most of the important lines that you're likely to face when you play this opening. Which means that if you haven't watched that part, you should watch it first. That's clearly the most important video in the series. In part 2, I took a look at a couple of lines that I didn't cover in part 1 that I got asked about, and I also showed a lot of positional themes that can come up in this opening. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about some stuff that is a lot more aggressive, a lot more tactical than any of the things that I've been talking about so far. And we're going to see a new plan for white that we haven't really talked about yet. The plan occurs specifically when black has inserted the moves knight c6, and we've played knight c3. In this position, if you go to the Lichess computer and you use the show threat button, which evaluates the position as if it were white to move again, the Lichess or Stockfish computer will claim that there are two moves that achieve a clear and large advantage for white. One of them is just e3, which should make a lot of sense to you because that achieves a tempo up version of a lot of the normal Doof Attack positions that we've been looking at. However, the other move and the idea that I want to talk to you about in this video is e4. And after e4, white is going to play some very aggressive and tactical ideas that I want to share with you in today's video. A lot of people try to play the move e4 in this sort of opening without really understanding the ideas behind it or in positions where it doesn't make sense. If we play e4, we are taking on some positional risk, because if black ever takes on e4, then our pawn on d4 becomes isolated and weak. If you imagine in this position that we play e4, black takes, and we take back with the knight, then black could just play queen takes d4, and we're down a pawn for probably no compensation. That's not the idea. Instead, the idea I want to show you today is e4, pawn takes e4, and then d5. This gains a lot of space in the center with tempo, kicking the opponent's knight. Later, we may play something like knight e2, knight g3, and get this pawn back, which will be hard for black to defend. And in the meantime, the pawn on d5 will exert a major cramping influence. Very often, we will give a check along the a4 to e8 diagonal, and you will find that white will have a big initiative in a lot of these positions, and very often there are some cool tactics, which I'm going to show you today. Before going any further, I want to offer a couple of disclaimers of sorts about what's to come. First of all, I can't think of almost any position I've ever seen in this opening where it's necessary for white to play for this e4, d5 idea. It's always just something that white can go for. The positions have a tendency to become very complicated, as opposed to the simple strategic positions that we've been talking about previously. And since this is a very non-theoretical, kind of unknown sort of opening, we're going to be looking at a lot of unexplored lines and therefore relying more heavily on computer analysis and things like that as opposed to positional principles that I've shown you in the previous videos. With that out of the way though, I do think you'll have a lot of fun taking a look at some of the lines that I'm going to show for the rest of this video, because there is some really wild stuff that can happen in these e4, pawn takes e4, and d5 lines within the Doof Attack. In video number 1, I spent a great deal of time talking about the line Qb6 in response to bishop g5. And it was very important to establish that when white plays knight c3, black cannot take on b2 because white achieves a winning position after knight takes d5. If you are confused about the reasons why and you're interested in playing this opening for white, please go back and watch video number 1 because I covered this line in depth. However, black does not have to take the pawn on b2, and they definitely shouldn't, and one move they can play is knight c6. Additionally, instead of queen b6 right away, black may also play knight c6 here, and then on knight c3, they can play queen b6. I touched on this very briefly in video number 1, but I want to talk about it more now. In this position, there are many moves that white can play. I think white can play e3, white can play knight f3. The most popular move in the Lichess Master database was actually queen d2. However, the move that I'm going to talk about here, as an example of the theme of this video, is going to be e4. I'm not sure if this move is enough to give white an advantage, but it's definitely a lot of fun, and I'm going to show you some of the cool lines. After e4, black has a bunch of possible moves, but we're going to start by looking at what happens if black plays pawn takes e4. As I mentioned at the beginning, when black plays pawn takes e4, our idea is not to take back, but instead to push d5, kicking this knight away. and gaining a lot of space in the center. Now black has a bunch of options, but white is doing very well in all cases. Let's go through them. Queen takes b2. Well, here, if we take on c6, they can take on c3 with check. So we're not going to do that. But white has two winning moves here. One of them is knight b5, which looks really nice because we're threatening to take the knight, and we're also threatening knight c7. Black can complicate things a little bit by playing knight b4, then we go rook b1, knight c2, king d2, and in this position, the only response for black would be queen e5. In this line, black is going to be up 2 pawns, because when we take on c2, they can take on g5 with check, and we go king e1. However, they have a big problem, which is we're threatening knight c7, and there's not much they can do about it. Actually, the best move for black, according to the computer, seems to be e6, and that allows knight c7, followed by knight takes a8. Instead of this, though, white also can play rook c1 right away, and this seems to be stronger. If now black plays knight e5, white can play knight b5. White is threatening knight c7 again. In case black plays king d8, not only do we have the idea maybe to break through with d6 at some moment, but we can play rook c2, and the opponent's queen is getting trapped. Believe it or not, after queen b4 check, we just go bishop d2. Now if they go queen a4, we have rook c8 followed by queen takes, and so black is going to lose material here, and white has a winning position. Instead of taking on b2, it makes a lot more sense for black to try to save their knight. Black can play knight b8, which might be the relatively best move, but then not only can white just play knight g2 directly, but if you're concerned about the pawn on b2, you can also play queen c2 first, and then something like bishop f5, knight g2. The knight will go to g3, eventually white will get the pawn back on e4, and also white has a lot more development, more space, more activity. I really like white's position here. A more human response would be for black to play knight e5. And then the move I would recommend is bishop f4. The point of this is that if we manage to kick black's knight away, for example knight g6, then we can play bishop b5 check and black will have to move their king. For example, bishop d7, bishop takes, black has to play king takes. And this is a really nice position. White's going to be down material, but black's king is running around in the center, and white should have a ton of compensation for 1 or 2 pawns. Here our bishop is hanging, maybe bishop e3. Black can take on b2, but after knight ge2, I think anyone would rather have white here, as black's king is very unsafe. There are other options for black. For example, here, black can play f6, trying to maintain their knight on e5, and then I think white can just play bishop b5 and argue that a lot of the light squares have been weakened by black pushing f6, and it's going to be very hard for them to develop. Also, black can play knight d3, and we'll just take this, pawn takes d3, queen takes d3, next we bring this knight out, and we castle. Really nice looking position for white in my opinion. And finally, black can try knight d7. Here, there's a sequence of computer-generated only moves, which lead to a very nice position for white. After knight b5, black has to find e5. Pawn takes e6, black has to play bishop b4 check. Bishop d2, bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, and now, instead of taking on e6, black should play knight c5. But here, not only can white take on f7, misplacing the black king, but even stronger seems to be queen c3. Now, white is threatening queen takes g7, white also has the idea to play rook d1, and then knight d6, and black's position seems to be on the verge of falling apart. For all of those reasons, I don't believe that black should play pawn takes e4 after we play e4 in this position. I think it's just too dangerous. We push d5, we get a lot of space and a big initiative. There are several other pawns black can try to take here, but I don't think that works too well either. They can try queen takes d4, for instance, but then we can play knight takes d5. In this position, white's threatening knight c7, and although black can take what looks like a free pawn in the center, we just go bishop e2. Now, if black plays queen takes g2, knight c7 is checkmate. And if black instead tries to defend the c7 square by playing queen e5, we can play bishop f4, and we'll play knight c7 next with a completely winning position. Also, black can try taking on b2, but this is bad for the same reason as it's bad in the variation with 4 queen b6 that I talked about in the first video. White goes knight takes d5, threatening knight c7. Just like I mentioned in the first video, when black goes e6, you first should throw in the move rook b1 to take better control over this important b4 square where they want to give a check. And after queen takes a2, knight c7, king d7, and knight takes a8, you should pay attention to your opponent's ideas. When black goes bishop b4, you can't actually play bishop d2 here, because they will take, and after queen takes, they can take on b1. So you have to give back some of the material. Thankfully, after rook takes b4, knight takes b4, and queen c1, white is totally winning, and so once again, black is not able to snatch the b2 pawn against the Doof attack. I don't want to give you the impression that after e4, white just has some great position. As I mentioned, I'm not even sure that e4 is the best move for white in the position, and black has one response that gets them pretty close to equalizing if they play correctly, and that is e6. The point of this move is now black may be ready to take on e4 because they're less concerned about d5, and also they can develop this bishop actively. So probably white should play pawn takes d5 here, creating a symmetrical structure. Now, in the master database, I saw some games where white continued with bishop b5, but I'm also fond of the move bishop d3. I like this move because there are a couple pawns hanging, but I don't know if black should even take them. If black goes queen takes d4, I really like white's compensation after knight f3, queen b6, and castles short, and white has a big advantage in activity and development. The same goes for knight takes d4. I would just play knight g2, and recapture with the queen and give a check, castle short. I really like white. Also, queen takes b2 not only can be met by knight takes d5, but maybe even stronger is knight b5 because it prevents black's intended defense, which was bishop d6. Anyway, I think after bishop d3, black should probably play bishop d6, and it could be a little bit easier for white to develop because white has the extra tempo. Knight f3, black can't really go knight f6 because it will take it and mess with their pawns, so maybe they should put this knight on e7. And I did find one kind of cool idea. Let's say black goes bishop g4, castles, knight g7, rook e1, and castles. White can play bishop takes e7 here. Now, if bishop takes, we can play knight takes d5. So black will try knight takes, but then we have bishop takes h7, followed by knight g5, and queen takes g4. Another line where white can go for the e4 idea, and where I particularly like it because it leads to some very fun positions, is bishop f5 here. After bishop f5, white can definitely play a positional approach, maybe e3, sometimes even f3 followed by e4 can be fun. But I really like e4 in this position because it's pretty tricky and there are some cool variations. If black plays pawn takes e4, then our intention is to play d5, and after knight e5, we can give a check on a4. In this position, black has two ways to block. They definitely can't play queen d7 because we have bishop b5. So their options are limited to either bishop d7 or knight d7. I believe that bishop d7 is a bit inaccurate and allows white to get a clear advantage. After queen takes e4, black should probably play f6 here, which is very ugly. The reason is, if they play knight g6, white has a winning position, believe it or not, with the move knight b5. There are other moves that were pretty good for white, but this one's really nice. White's threatening knight d6 checkmate. And if black tries to defend with the queen, for example, queen b6, we can kick the queen away with bishop e3. The queen needs to keep in touch with both d6 and c7, and after queen a5 check, we just go b4, and black is going to have to give up some material here. So instead, in the position where we played queen a4 check, they should probably block with the knight. And then white can play a typical plan, by the way, in these sorts of positions, knight g e2, followed by knight g3. White will get the pawn back at their leisure on e4, and white has a big space advantage. So we've seen what happens if black takes this with a pawn. Now let's see what happens if black plays bishop takes e4. We will play the same way. Knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, and d5. And now if black plays knight e5, we can again go queen a4 check. Black cannot play queen d7 because bishop b5 wins the queen. So they'll go knight d7, and now instead of playing queen takes e4, when maybe black could bring this knight to f6 with a tempo, we can just play knight e2 and bring this knight round to c3. It's tough for black to develop. They can't play e6 right now because their pawn is pinned. But even if it weren't pinned, they wouldn't want to do that because it would ruin their pawn structure. For example, after knight f6, we could take it, or we could just play knight c3, and now on e6, we would take, maybe bishop c4, and I think white would be doing great. Also, if black plays g6, they have to watch out, because white may play d6, breaking through in the center. And on pawn takes d6, something like bishop f6, bishop b5, Then white can castle, bring the rook to e1, and black is probably not going to survive the opening here, as they are very tied up and their king is in the center. Instead of moving the knight from c6 though, a lot of players with black will come up with something that at first glance seems very clever, and that is queen a5 check. The point of this move is that if we play queen d2, black will happily trade queens, and then they will be up a pawn, they will save their knight, and they will have a great endgame. If we go bishop d2, then they can just take the pawn on d5, and they're up 2 pawns here for absolutely no compensation. So this looks really annoying for white, until you find the brilliant response b4. This is one of my favorite positions in the whole opening. If black plays queen takes b4 check, we go bishop d2, and they have 2 pieces hanging, and white is winning. So instead, black will probably play knight takes b4, and you still go bishop d2, and you're ready to play a3 and pick up the knight on the next move. The only way for black to stop that is mechanically, as a lot of chess authors like to say. That is, they just put the queen on a3 so that we can't play a3 ourselves. Here, I think the best option for white is bishop b5, forcing black to move their king to d8. I could stop the analysis here because white clearly has great compensation for 2 pawns, but I wanted to give you a bit more direction. Rook b1 seems to be the best move, and now we're attacking the knight on b4. Black could defend it by playing e6, but that would be really dangerous to open up the line against their king. We would just play d takes e6. Black can try knight takes d5, but then white goes bishop b4. And I think this variation is really cool. On queen takes a2, white goes knight e2 with the idea to bring the knight to c3. And black seems to be dead here. Also, after rook b1, black may go knight d3 check. But we take it, and no matter how they take back, we can take on b7. For example, pawn takes d3, rook takes b7, and if black is really greedy and tries to take on a2 and then d5, a really nice move for white that wins the game here is queen a4. The point is that now if they take the rook, we have bishop a5 check and black can resign. Also, if black plays queen takes d3, then we can play rook takes b7, and if they go something like queen a6, we go queen b3. Here, we're ready to play knight e2 and castle. Don't be concerned about the possibility that in a position like this, castles, black can play queen takes e2, because we always have bishop a5 check. Black's king is not going to get safe anytime soon. It does take some effort to win these positions because you are down material, but obviously they have a big problem with the king safety and we have good development, so these positions are always winning for white. And you will get some of these lines when you play the Doof Attack if you play this e4 followed by d5 idea against bishop f5. In order to reach the lines that I just showed you, I tend to meet bishop f5 on move 4 with knight c3. Because now if black plays knight c6, I can play e4 and the position transposes completely to what we just looked at. However, I want to caution you against playing e4 unless you're 100% sure that it works tactically. e4 creates complications in the position. It's not a quiet positional move like we've been looking at. There are concrete factors that you have to calculate when you play it. I'm going to give you an example of a situation where it doesn't work. Let's say that instead of playing knight c6, black first inserts h6. In accordance with video number 1, we play bishop h4 because we want to meet knight f6 with bishop takes. And only now, let's say black plays knight c6. Here, e4 does not work. And there's a big difference. Our bishop has been kicked to a different diagonal. Here, if we go e4, black can play bishop takes, and on knight takes, pawn takes, and d5, the queen a5 idea that they went for in the variation we looked at a moment ago would work very well now, because we no longer have b4 and bishop d2. This means that we would probably have to play queen d2, they would trade queens and go into an ending up a pawn with a great position. So instead, after knight c6 in this position, we should play something more positional. Maybe you could play f3 with the idea e4, or you can just keep it simple and play e3. Maybe later you go bishop d3 or queen b3, and it's a very flexible position, a lot of possibilities, not a very theoretical line, the sort of stuff that we've talked about before. The point is that e4 is just another weapon in your arsenal. It's something that you can use, something I want you to be aware of, but it doesn't work in every position. Hopefully now you have a good idea about the possibility of playing e4 in the bishop g5 exchange Slav. It's a much more aggressive way to play than the stuff we've been talking about, but it can lead to some crazy, wild positions, so I wanted to share it with you. In the last video in this series, I'm going to cover my favorite game that I ever played in this opening, and then I'm probably going to be done. Maybe I'll make some videos on some other topics if you guys want me to do so, but I think that's going to be the end of the Doof Attack series once I finish that fourth and final video, which should be pretty soon. Thank you guys so much for the support watching these first 3 videos, and I will see you next time.